When we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, the images that come to mind are of a military genius, a towering figure of European history, a man who reshaped the map of the continent through strategy and iron will. He defeated coalitions of kings, ruled an empire stretching from Spain to Poland, and remains one of the most studied commanders in history. But here's a story you won't find in most textbooks. One day, Napoleon, conqueror of nations, master of armies, was forced into a retreat. Not by Austrian soldiers or Russian winters, but by an army of rabbits. Yes, rabbits. This bizarre tale, part comedy and part parable, reminds us that even the greatest figures of history were human. And sometimes, history's strangest moments are the ones that survive longest. Setting the scene, Napoleon after. Victory. The year was 1807. Napoleon had just concluded the Treaty of Tilsit, a major diplomatic triumph after years of bloody warfare. By defeating the Prussians and coming to terms with the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, Napoleon secured a fragile peace in Europe. For a brief moment, the guns fell silent, and the emperor could afford a little celebration. And what better way to celebrate in the aristocratic tradition of the time than with a grand hunting party? Hunting was not just leisure, it was symbolic. It showed mastery over nature, courage, and nobility. For Napoleon, who loved spectacle as much as power, a well-organized hunt seemed like the perfect way to mark his victory. So he gave the order, prepare a rabbit hunt. His loyal chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, took charge of arranging the details. But Berthier would make one decision that turned this ordinary event into a moment of absurd legend. The plan for the great rabbit hunt Napoleon expected a noble hunt. Dozens of his officers would line up in a field, their weapons ready. Servants and beaters would flush out rabbits which would scatter across the meadow, and the hunters would shoot them down in style. But hunting rabbits in the wild was unpredictable. Would there be enough game to make the emperor's hunt satisfying? Berthier wanted everything perfect for Napoleon, so he came up with a brilliant solution. Instead of relying on chance, he would purchase hundreds, perhaps thousands, of rabbits from local farmers. That way, when the hunt began, the rabbits would be released in front of Napoleon and his men. It would be easy, plentiful, and grand. At least that was the plan. The hunt begins. The day arrived. The field was prepared. Cages and crates filled with rabbits were lined up. Napoleon, dressed in his hunting attire, stood with his entourage, ready for sport. The servants opened the cages and hundreds of rabbits hopped into the open. At first, everything seemed normal. The hunters raised their weapons, expecting the rabbits to scatter in panic. But the rabbits didn't scatter. They didn't bolt into the bushes or run for their lives. Instead, they turned and they advanced. The rabbit attack. To everyone's shock, the rabbits didn't behave like wild game. They bounded toward the hunters, not in fear, but in excitement. And they didn't stop. Dozens became hundreds, and hundreds became thousands. A furry tide swept across the field, ears flopping, whiskers twitching. And in the center of it all was Napoleon. The rabbits swarmed around his boots, tugged at his coat, even leapt onto the officers. The great conqueror of Europe was surrounded, not by enemy armies, but by hungry, relentless bunnies. Accounts say Napoleon tried to wave them off, even flicking his riding crop at the boldest of them. His officers laughed at first, until they too found themselves mobbed by rabbits climbing up their legs. Soon the laughter turned to chaos. Why did it happen? The mystery is simple when you think about it. These weren't wild rabbits. They were farm rabbits, domesticated animals used to being fed by humans. When Berthier purchased them in bulk, the farmers likely sent the fattest, tamest rabbits they had. So when the cages were opened, the rabbits didn't see hunters. They saw feeders. To them, Napoleon wasn't a predator. He was the lunchman. They charged not in defiance, but in appetite, believing the Emperor of France had arrived with baskets of vegetables. Napoleon Retreats. The scene turned slapstick. Officers tried to shoo the rabbits away, but more kept hopping forward. Napoleon, for once, was not in command. Surrounded and overwhelmed, he did what any sensible person would do. He retreated. Some say he tried to run toward his carriage, rabbits chasing at his heels. Others claim the bunnies actually leapt into the carriage itself, forcing servants to throw them out as Napoleon scrambled inside. Either way, Napoleon, a man who had faced cannon fire and cavalry charges, fled in defeat from a furry army. Was perhaps the only battle he ever lost so completely and so comically. The aftermath, needless to say, the hunt was a disaster. Napoleon was embarrassed, and Berthier had to accept responsibility for the blunder. The story spread quickly among the soldiers and courtiers. For years afterward, whispers of the rabbit attack followed Napoleon as a joke too delicious to be forgotten. While it never made it into the official histories Napoleon approved, the anecdote survived in memoirs and writings of the era. It became one of those odd, humanizing tales that historians love, proof that even the greatest conquerors can be humbled by the smallest creatures. Rabbits in symbolism and irony. There's something poetic about the incident. Napoleon, a man who prided himself on bending nations to his will, was undone, if only for an afternoon, by farm animals. Rabbits, in European folklore, often symbolize fertility, abundance, and even trickery. To have hundreds of them overwhelm Napoleon was like a cosmic prank, a reminder that nature and irony has a sense of humor. In another way, it was symbolic of Napoleon's own career. He controlled everything meticulously: his battles, his propaganda, his empire. But even the best-laid plans could collapse when reality didn't behave as expected. The rabbit hunt foreshadowed the chaos that would later consume his campaigns, especially in Russia, where his careful planning crumbled against forces he couldn't control. Was it really true? Skeptics might wonder, did this story actually happen? Or is it just a myth? Unlike many legends, the rabbit hunt has solid historical grounding. Multiple memoirs and anecdotes from Napoleon's contemporaries reference the incident. It was not a fabricated legend centuries later, but a story told within Napoleon's own lifetime. Of course, details vary. Some accounts claim a few hundred rabbits, others say over 3,000. Some insist Napoleon personally fled in terror. Others suggest he laughed along with the joke. But the core, that domesticated rabbits overwhelmed the emperor, is widely accepted as true. Why this story endures. The rabbit attack is remembered today not just because it's funny, but because it humanizes Napoleon. Great leaders are often remembered only for their victories and defeats in war, their political brilliance or tyranny. But stories like this remind us that they were also people, capable of embarrassment, humor, and absurdity. It's hard to relate to Napoleon on the battlefield at Austerlitz, but anyone who has been mobbed by over-enthusiastic animals at a petting zoo can relate to his rabbit ordeal. That relatability, that humor, makes the story timeless. Napoleon the man versus Napoleon the myth. Napoleon worked hard to craft an image of himself as larger than life. Portraits showed him stern, noble, and heroic. Propaganda described him as invincible. He wanted to be remembered alongside Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Yet here was an event that stripped away the myth and left the man awkward, flustered, maybe even chuckling nervously as rabbits nibbled at his boots. The contrast between the myth of Napoleon and the reality of the rabbit attack is part of what makes the story so irresistible. Echoes in popular culture. The rabbit incident has since appeared in countless retellings, from history blogs to comedy sketches. It's been featured in books of quirky history, shared online as a meme, and even referenced in pop culture. It's not surprising. In a world where most stories about Napoleon involve battles, betrayals, and revolutions, this one stands out for its sheer ridiculousness. It's history at its most entertaining. Lessons from the rabbit attack beyond the humor. What can we take away from this odd episode? Control is an illusion. Napoleon controlled armies and nations. But one mistake, buying farm rabbits instead of hunting wild ones, undid him. Even the mighty stumble. No matter how powerful someone seems, life has a way of humbling everyone. The best stories are the unexpected ones. History is not just wars and treaties. It's also the quirks, accidents, and absurdities that make it human. And so, among all the battles Napoleon fought, one stands apart. Not Austerlitz or Waterloo, but the day he faced an enemy unlike any other, a relentless horde of rabbits. It's a story that reminds us that history is not always solemn or grand. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's ridiculous, and sometimes it's exactly these moments that make the past feel alive. Napoleon may have conquered half of Europe, but the rabbits of 1807 conquered him. And perhaps that's why we still tell this story, because in the end it shows that even the greatest of men can be brought to their knees by the smallest of creatures.